we're good to go, I think.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so welcome everyone to our podcast, Women in System. So today we have the pleasure and extreme honor of speaking with a great professor and expert in the field of computer architecture, Natalie. And she is a professor of electrical and computer engineering in University of Toronto. And she holds various positions like Canada Research Chair in Computer Architecture, and she has won numerous accolades, including a lot of honors and best paper awards. She has graduated from Purdue University, and also she earned her PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. So today we will have the pleasure to discuss with her not only about her vision in the computer architecture field, but also about her career path. And recently she had started a course called Socially Responsible Computing. And she has also led some other DEI efforts, for example, like Women in Computer Architecture. So we'd also like to use this opportunity to get some of her insights on these fields. Okay, without further ado, let's start the interview. So first, let me start with like a brief question. Natalie, thanks a lot for joining us today. So do you mind sharing with us your interest in the research field and how you get there, why you are becoming like more and more interested in computer architecture and especially NOCs, network on chips? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about having this conversation. So, yeah, so I became interested in computer architecture when I was an undergrad based on some courses that I took, and so I wanted to pursue that for grad studies. And when I started grad school was kind of also the time that networks on chip emerged as a research area. So in the early 2000s, and so it seemed like a really exciting and promising opportunity. I think that, now we kind of take, multi-core processors for granted, that they're everywhere. But I think, in the early 2000s, this was representing kind of a sea change for how we were doing, architecture, a large shift from focusing on single-threaded performance to focusing on multi-core performance. And so the communication between cores and the network seemed like a, exciting field to get into. So that's, what I pursued during my PhD. And then, I continued to work in that area when I joined the University of Toronto as an assistant professor, and kind of then, as you move on in your career, your students come in with lots of different exciting ideas. And so the research has evolved, still doing some network on chip research, but also interested in lots of other topics within computer architecture. And I have a student now pushing me more into the system side of things. And so it's just an exciting thing to have, lots of different areas to explore. And there's lots of interesting challenges today, I think.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for sharing your journey. You mentioned several different areas as well. Previously, you also studied like a very hard area of cache coherence, I think, during your PhD, and later you evolved more on the system. And also recently you have some really exciting papers on different topics like energy harvesting, etc. So I was curious, could you discuss a little bit more about your thoughts on the evolving landscape of research topics, especially in computer architecture field, and how it impacts basically your vision and your direction of your own work? And how do you decide which area to put more energy or investment on? And basically, how do you balance these different types of topics? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a great set of questions. So, one of the things that I really love about being a faculty member is being able to sort of do, pursue whatever I would like to pursue, not having necessarily a manager or, some higher level, boss that says this is the thing that we're gonna focus on. And so being a professor, you get to kind of go wherever your interests lead you. And so, that's kind of how the research has evolved. And, there's now sort of, as you mentioned, I've looked at a variety of different topics. When I was early on in my faculty career, another emerging topic area was approximate computing. And, this just seemed really sort of intellectually fun to think about, how we can, if we introduce some errors, what kind of performance and energy benefits can we get? And so I had, some interest in exploring, that area with one of my PhD students. And then that led us into the energy harvesting and the IoT space, was kind of looking at application domains where where approximate computing makes sense. It makes sense in really resource constrained, ultra low power environments, environments where the incoming data is coming from, noisy sensors to begin with. And so you have this tolerance to error. And so that kind of led us into, the IoT space and the energy harvesting space. And from there, one of my PhD students has now gotten interested in, hardware security in the IoT space. So it's just kind of this, journey that maybe looking at the individual papers, it's not obvious what the journey is, but I can look back and kind of see, how we got from point A to point B. And, as you mentioned, now, one of my new emerging interests is in the area of, sustainability. And I think that this is just a really important topic that, is important sort of just very broadly across the globe. And so I find it just really, interesting to think about how, computer architects can have an impact there and how I can, impact that conversation. And so really, the research topics that we pursued have really just been led by curiosity and potential for impact, and what's really, sort of intellectually, interesting and fun to work on. That I, want to work on things that I'm excited to read papers about, I'm excited to talk to my students about. And so that's kind of guided the research.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic to hear. Thanks a lot for sharing your journey and talking about sustainability, especially for computer architecture community. Could you share with us a little bit more about your thoughts in this field, and also some of the highlights of your previous course in socially responsible computing? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this was something, the thinking about sustainability and about other broader sort of societal implications of computing. It was something that kind of started for me, during the pandemic. I think, I had, a lot of time sitting at home, watching cartoons on Netflix with my daughter. And I was like, okay, thinking about what I could, what I'll do after we get back to kind of normal, and what new challenges and opportunities I saw for myself. And I was really inspired by a paper, an effort led by Carol Jean Wu and David Brooks, and their work on sort of this idea of, measuring the carbon footprint of computing and thinking about, okay, I hadn't really thought about it before, but it seemed like it was a great, opportunity to have impact. I think we've seen a lot of challenges over the last several years related to climate change, as we have, increasingly, catastrophic wildfires, and we have, stronger, weather systems and hurricanes. And so sitting at home, kind of watching all of this, on the news, I thought, what can I do to have impact here? And so I really wanted to start thinking about, sustainability in research. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to be kind of reading all these papers and trying to get myself up to speed, I could also use that effort to kind of prepare a course and to get, grad students involved in this conversation. And so the course I decided, wouldn't be, it's our semester's 12 weeks here. It wouldn't be 12 weeks on sustainability. I wanted to kind of, broaden that. And so I called it, socially responsible computing. We spent roughly the first half talking about environmental impacts and sustainability. And then we talked about, ethics. We talked about some EDI issues. We talked about things like, potential for racism and bias in machine learning. We talked about security and privacy. And, all of the discussions were somewhat underpinned by a discussion of computer hardware and computer architecture, because that's what I know. But so we talked, we also talked about other types of accelerators that have some strong potential for good, thinking about things like, accelerators for healthcare or for genomics. And so wanted to not not be all doom and gloom that, computing is having a negative impact on things, but think about, both positive and negative impacts, and really encourage students to think, think beyond performance and power, and think about, how are these systems going to be used? How can we, think about environmental impacts, ethical implications? And it was a lot of fun to develop the course. Definitely, a bit, further away from what I've historically taught, but, the grad students, we had some great discussions. Everyone was really engaged. And so I was really pleased with how it turned out.
That's great. I think all these topics you mentioned, like sustainability, carbon footprint, and fairness, these are all incredibly important and impactful. And I feel like recently a lot of computer architects or system researchers, they start to think along new dimensions, like not only power, performance, throughput, latency, these traditional metrics. So this is definitely very helpful for a more socially responsible computer system design. I'm actually very curious to hear about your thoughts. For example, like when we are currently using a lot of large language model like ChatGPT, I think under the hood, there are a lot of training resources and inference resources. And these are all powered by computer system and large scale data centers. So from maybe an approximate computing perspective, how do you connect dots to lines? Maybe when we are doing these resource design or allocation for these large language models, and how do you think that as an architect or computer system researcher in the era of LLM, how could we contribute to like a more socially responsible design? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think one of the things, that, people have been discussing a lot, it's sort of the intersection of these issues is the, the amount of energy that goes into training these large language models. And so I think certainly, having, thinking about the use of accelerators and custom silicon can be one way architects can impact, the operational, energy that is required to train these models, and also then to run them. I think that if you look at, the number of people who, are trying out ChatGPT, I mean, the numbers are staggering. And so all of this compute, whether or not it's, truly useful, I think a lot of people are kind of playing with it just for kind of fun. And so but you want to make sure that it's running efficiently in the data center. And so thinking about, the hardware that is supporting, things like ChatGPT, the networks, the systems architecture, and how we interact with these models, I think is one way that architects, can, contribute. And then I think we also, thinking in the, data and storage side as well. There are other implications in architecture, but I think, it's a very broad field, and there's a lot of things that, I think need to be carefully considered from, where we get the data, how the data is curated, which isn't really, I think, an architectural or sort of systems thing, but that's an important aspect of it. And then how we manage that data, how we, maintain, privacy, and how hardware can support things like privacy and various issues that sort of also touch into, these models and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions that remain as the models become larger, more complex, they can do more things. It's going to put a lot of pressure on systems. So I think that's a great topic for people to be looking at.
I also have a question. I think socially responsible computing is really interesting and important. However, it's like biggest challenge that I see there is how can we actually find a way to influence the industry to listen to what we find, how to transfer this accountability of watts and joules to the people who actually manage this large system. So I wonder if you have some ideas, maybe thoughts.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question because yeah, I mean at the end of the day, industry is going to care about, things like their stock price and how many, units they're selling. And so, I think that there is a tension here. We certainly see a lot of industries, caring a lot more about things like their environmental, footprint. The companies are, data center companies are investing in more renewable energy, and they're doing more reporting to say these are the steps that we're taking to achieve, net zero emissions. And so I think they do care. So I think that, we can continue to push on things like, energy, because energy is going to always be important. And so I think that companies will care about that. I think also, if steps that we take to, say, reduce embodied emissions, I think these will also potentially be attractive if we think about, how to, make use of more efficient process technologies. One of the other areas of research that I looked at a few years ago was chiplet-based systems. And so the idea that you could, take multiple small chiplets and then integrate them together into a larger system. One of the things that chiplets enables is that each chip can be manufactured in a different process node. And so, older process technologies are more efficient from a carbon standpoint because they've had more time to mature and they're, maybe less complex. And so if you have, certain parts of your chip don't require, a 5 nanometer process technology, you can potentially, reduce carbon, through different techniques. So I think, and that would also likely impact, the cost to the company to manufacture those chips, would influence the, the yield rates and stuff like that. So I think you can spin, environmental benefits also as economic benefits to the companies. And so that has to be kind of kept in mind as we think about translating the research into actual practice.
Actually, the chiplet research is the one that you did with AMD, right? So since we all have, chiplets in front of our eyes, like in production right now, so I guess it can be considered a success example. So maybe you can share some, experience, maybe advice for people to establish this kind of knowledge transfer to the industry, or maybe just an effective collaboration with industry experts.
Yeah, so yeah, the collaboration with AMD on the chiplet work was really a lot of fun and really, really interesting. And so, this started as thinking about, where, sort of where to go with some of the network on chip research that I had been doing, thinking about other styles of connecting things. And so this idea of, connecting multiple chiplets was kind of an interesting problem. And so talking to, collaborating with Gabe Lowe at AMD Research, and, I was sort of planning at that time also for my sabbatical. And so I did my part of my sabbatical at AMD Research in Bellevue. And so that was kind of a really nice collaboration, started while I was at U of T, deepened the collaboration while, spending some time at AMD, and I think, helped kind of affect some technology transfer, and was really nice to kind of see, that industry perspective and see what they were working on. So I was really glad, to have the opportunity to do, an industry-based sabbatical. I think that nowadays it's really common for PhD students right after they graduate, if they're going into academia, they kind of do a 1-year industry sabbatical. I didn't do that before I started my assistant professor position. So when my first sabbatical rolled around, being at a company was something I really wanted to try out. And so that helped with that collaboration as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot for sharing. I think one very interesting topic that we touch upon is the collaboration with industry. And I think to have a good relationship with the industry to push forward the frontier of the technology while also having like the core fundamental research contribution and insight is super important. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions for students who are working on with industry, or for young professors who is trying to write grant proposals, or for industry collaborations. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one opportunity, as graduate students, I think, going on, internships, having the opportunity to spend some time, at companies and maybe, trying to align the internship with, your PhD, interests as well. So hopefully that will, net some, further collaboration. And then I think, some of the other collaborations that I've had with industry have also just, spawned out of networking and, going to conferences. I think this was something that I, sorely missed during, the virtual conference years of COVID, was just having those sort of serendipitous conversations where, you're telling someone what you do and they express interest in, a similar topic, or, it sparks some idea on their side. And so I think that's another thing. So I do encourage, as we've really resumed our in-person conferences, I think taking advantage, students being able to attend those and take advantage of as much, networking opportunities as they can is really the way to kind of, see what industry is doing and potentially, seed some future collaborations.
We also wonder how like you chaired ASPOS 23, so it's one of the first conferences that came out of COVID times as new. So do you see any change? Do you think we can provision better for like future things like COVID, like maybe some experiences you would like to share with us?
Sure, absolutely. So I had a phenomenal time co-chairing ASPOS 23 program co-chair with Mike Swift. And, I think that I think the conference was tremendously successful, and a lot of credit to Tor Ahmoud, who was the general chair, and kind of pulling it off. One thing, that Tor did that I think is, really important is to ensure that we continue to provide, a virtual option. I think that, many are excited to be back in person, but the reality of today's world, I think, is that not everybody, can be in person. We found that, there are a lot of visa backlogs in, the Canadian immigration system. A lot of students were unable to, get a visa to attend the conference in person. And so I think we need to make sure we're still providing, some robust virtual experience to support, students who can't get visas, to support, researchers that maybe cannot afford to make the trip, that it's a, long and expensive trip, support people with caregiving responsibilities that make it difficult for them to travel. And so I think that, I was obviously there in person, but I heard good things about kind of the virtual side of things, that the quality of the audio and video were very good, and there was, virtual engagement. And so I think that, we sort of, a lot of kudos to all the COVID conference organizers who had to do all this virtual stuff, and it was really challenging, and we didn't have this notion of best practices, and nobody knew what they were doing. And I think everybody did a really great job, and I think we need to take that and we need to continue to apply it to conferences. I think that we can't expect that we'll have 100% in-person attendance. We want to make sure that we have, it's an equity issue, reach a broad set of the population, expose junior people to research that they might not otherwise be exposed to. And so I was glad that we were able to support virtual presentations at ASPOS. I don't remember the exact number, but I would say probably 20% of the presenters presented virtually for a variety of reasons. And so it was primarily in person, and it was, optimized for in person, but we had a good experience online. And, also then, having everything on Zoom also makes it super easy to record them. They're not super high quality recordings, but all the talks are now on the SIGARCH YouTube channel. And so it gives a more archival, feeling to it. You can now, see a talk if you missed it. And so I think all of those things are great, and we need to keep doing those in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing, Natalie. I was actually curious, as ASPOS has been a prestigious conference, and the topics has been evolving. And for this year, we see some new topics centered around optimizing for the system efficiency of LLM, for example. So looking back, I think there's always like a cyclic nature of research trends in terms of the topics of focus. So how do you ensure that the work we are doing maintains a long-lasting impact without beyond like a hype? And is there any strategies or thinking process that you use to identify such long-term big problems or questions? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so one of the things, I think I really love about Ask Plus is the breadth of topics that it encompasses, and sort of the wide, diversity of people that it attracts. And so, then one of the challenges is, sort of deciding, what is Ask Plus and what it isn't. And so I think that, what Mike and I felt, and I think what many, other program chairs have also felt, is that, we want to kind of be this big tent community. We want to welcome a variety of topics. Certainly they have to have, some tie-in to, one of the three core areas of Ask Plus. They can't be, totally in left field. But I think that, if the work is, presents some insight, presents some innovation, I think it's worth publishing, and we should then, time, will tell. Some papers will, sort of percolate up to being really impactful, and some may end up having, marginal impact. But, if the reviewers read it and said it was technically sound and it provided some insight, I think that's, that's worth publishing. So, Mike and I also were sort of aiming to, push the acceptance rate higher than the historical average, sort of wanting to say there's a lot of great work happening in the systems community that we want to get out there. And so, we didn't sort of, if reviewers felt it fell within the scope of Ask Plus, we were happy to accept that. And so we do see, a lot of diversity. There are challenges there. You have to construct a set of reviewers that are expert in all of these topics, and, things like quantum has, a large number of papers, but maybe fewer reviewers. And so, there are definitely logistical challenges, but we want to be, very open to, new and emerging topics, and sort of see where they take the community in the coming years.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Talking of diversity, actually, one of the goals that we pursue when we arrange this series of episodes is actually support women in computer systems and other underrepresented minorities. So we are part of, I guess, this big drive towards diversity from our community, and it would be really interesting to hear your story and your perspective on how this initiative has been developing, like from the origin to the point where you joined it, and how you saw it at that time, and how maybe you see it differently, or maybe a similar way you see it now, and what future you would envision for this initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think things like this are, that you're doing are really phenomenal. And I think it's a great effort to help, increase, diversity and representation. When I joined the architecture community, there were, I would say you could kind of point to a fairly small number of senior women architects, and, there was not, the numbers were very, very small. And so, in the mid 2000s was sort of when this WIC Arch, the Women in Computer Architecture group, kind of formed. It was very informal. One of the primary motivators was often, when a female graduate student was attending a conference, they were the only one from their university or their research group who was attending, and we wanted to kind of find roommates to offset the cost to advisors so we could go to more conferences. And so WIC Arch kind of formed in part to be sort of this roommate finding service, finding, another female architect to share a hotel room with. And then we would, get together informally at conferences, have, breakfast together and kind of chat and get to know each other. The first few, WIC Arch gatherings that I attended, maybe 10 people. And, in the last several years, we've really tried to put a lot more, effort into it. And we have, we have a Slack group that, has over, 250 members. And so we have, many more women. And I think, still not a huge number of senior women, but certainly, more senior women than there were, before. And I think that, being able to, look to someone and say, okay, there's someone who looks like me, or who, I identify with, who's succeeding in the field, can be really, inspirational. I think that was really helpful for me, early on when I ventured into the area of networks on chip. My advisor, Miko Leposti, suggested we collaborate with Li Pei. And that was just fantastic. She's technically amazing, but she was also just a great, mentor for me as well. And sort of seeing her, succeed at Princeton, and then, MIT, and now in Singapore, it's just been, a great influence on me. And so also kind of wanting to pay that forward as I, have progressed through my career, kind of, helping, mentor more junior faculty members. So I think that these, initiatives are really great, and, ways to form connections, between people, now that we have, all this, great technology to do these kinds of meetings and get people to, interact and get to know each other on various platforms. I think it's been really great. I think we still have a ways to go in terms of the numbers, but I've just been super encouraged, several years ago, when I was at ISCA, and, Susan Eggers was the first female winner of the Eckert-Mockley Award, recognized for her contributions in simultaneous multi-threading. And then, in several years later, Margaret Martinosi, and just seeing, these women recognized for their outstanding achievements at kind of the highest level in our field was just really inspirational. And I think that it, has helped inspire, a lot of young women and a lot of people who are underrepresented in our field. And so I'm really encouraged by the state of things. I'm also really encouraged by sort of the energy of the students in our community, this group here, as well as the Computer Architecture Student Association that we have. And, students are just, really, I think, invested in, in bettering the community for themselves and for others. And I just love to see that. So I applaud the energy that you're bringing to these efforts.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, so you see a big positive change, since maybe when you were a PhD student yourself, to where we are now, right? Do you see anything lacking? Can we do better? Should we, I don't know, spawn new initiatives, or maybe do something extra to engage more, maybe undergraduate student as well as a graduate student into the community, because this works as a funnel, right? So the more undergraduate we have, the more PhDs we'll have, and the more successful professors at the end we'll probably be able to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, getting more undergraduates, engaged, and particularly looking at, women and people of color, could be really, really important. In architecture, there's an undergraduate mentoring workshop that is affiliated with ISCA that happens, every year. It was in person and then virtual and back in person this year. And I think, one of the things, architecture is, potentially, and, maybe also systems, is not the hottest field in computer science right now. And so one thing is just making sure we have lots of students excited about architecture. I think that, the number of students applying to do ML things is probably off the charts, but we want to make sure that we're, letting students know what architecture and systems can contribute to, the broader CS landscape, and getting students, excited and engaged. And so I think that those efforts are, really great. The other thing I think we can, potentially pay a little more attention to is broadening, geographic representation. I think that we see that, more now than when I was a graduate student. Conferences are, moving all over the world. When I was a graduate student, the majority of conferences were held in North America. And so, there is a North America centric sort of view of things, and, the time zone in which things happen favors North America, and, these sorts of things. And so I think we need to be more mindful of geographic representation, and trying to broaden, that representation in the architecture and systems community. And so that's another area that I think can, see more, more attention as well.
Yeah, I would like to. I totally agree with this, and at the same time, geopolitics creates new burdens, and bringing students to conferences and allowing them to connect. I'm talking about countries like Iran or like China. We students from where experience a lot of trouble like coming. Like you mentioned, a lot of presenters have to do their talks online. I also recently was at Eurosys, and I also had a feeling that 20-30% of talks were actually online, or represented by someone in the room, like their advisor, for example. So that may have implications on how the community operates.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's definitely, a challenge. I had a PhD student from Iran, and, he was the idea, the ability to get a visa, to enter the United States was near impossible. And so being able to make sure that, people have access to in-person conference experiences and that they do move around. And yeah, there are a lot of, geopolitical issues, and, I think conference organizers, kind of need to be aware of that and consider some of these issues as well.
That's true. And what I was wondering is, how do you see the community of women in architecture, or like underrepresented minorities in architecture? How they come together with the rest of the community? Should it be a collaborative effort? Should it be more like a closed environment where people can find support? Maybe some lessons learned from like different models you tried or you saw that work better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is, there's a balance needs to be struck, I think, between, having sort of safe spaces where, women can talk about issues they maybe don't want to voice to the broader community, while also, having allies and having, support. There are a large number of, wonderful allies in computer architecture, and making sure that they're also, part of these conversations. And so I think that, this was very evident when, Margaret Martinosi got up and made a statement at Micro about the lack of representation and the lack of diversity. And there were a large number of allies who, stood with her as she, made her statement. And so I think making sure that, the activities can't just be, always a closed group, but also knowing that, there are sometimes things that people are more comfortable sharing, with smaller groups. And so finding that balance and making sure that, we are striking the right balance, I think is tricky, but I think having, more broad conversations is really important. And I appreciate that, we're having more of these conversations. Timothy Pinkston organized a panel at HPCA a couple of years ago and sort of made sure that there were, sort of some strong allies on that panel. So we were discussing diversity, both from, there were several women, but also some men who could bring in that notion of allyship. So I think those sorts of things are also really valuable, and having these, not just sort of women's mentoring events, but having these types of panels that are for, the entire conference and everybody can be part of those conversations, I think is really important.
Yeah, I agree. It's an effort by the whole community for like the better community on its own. So it's not just the problem of minorities to help themselves, but the whole community to actually take the lead for a better future. Yeah.
Exactly.
Ying, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I will just echo with what Natalie earlier shared. I personally also feel it's very important to have kind of a mentorship type of thing. And I'm really grateful throughout my career that I have very amazing mentors. So Natalie, you also mentioned that earlier you had a lot of opportunities to learn from prestigious women researchers. So do you mind sharing with us several episodes or stories about how they influence you from both research or life perspective? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've been really fortunate to have some amazing mentors, in the field of computer architecture, and influence both, sort of being able to see, that I could succeed, that this career path was a plausible career path for me. I think was really important. I think it was also important to say, to see that to see women who had the life that I also envisioned having. And so, for example, when I started collaborating with Li Xuanpei, she had, a young child. And so seeing her, balance motherhood and her assistant professor position was really, sort of useful, and thinking about, how to make that work and how to achieve, that life balance. And so I think that was really, beneficial. And, also, I think when you're a PhD student and, you're having papers rejected, and it can be really sort of discouraging, and you can, I think maybe think, well, do I really want to sign up to do this for the rest of my life? Like, do I want to keep going through these rejection cycles? And, having faculty, I remember Sarita Adve came and gave a talk at Wisconsin, and then we had a roundtable with grad students, and, she asked, I think she asked us who was thinking about faculty positions, and only myself, I think, and one other person raised their hand. And, she talked about what a great, job it was, and how much, she loved what she did. And so I think, having people sort of, explicitly express that they really find a lot of joy in what they do, and that they're really inspired, by what they do, was also, really fantastic. And so feeling like, okay, the rejection is, normalizing the rejection, saying even award-winning researchers have lots of papers rejected, normalizing the rejection, and then still, highlighting, the joy of this job, because it really is phenomenal. I feel really fortunate to get to do the job that I do. And so that has also been really helpful. And then I also, during my PhD, I spent a little time at Princeton as just a visitor, and getting a chance to interact with Margaret Martinosi, and she's been a sort of lifelong mentor to me now over the last, almost 20 years, I would say. And that's just been, great to see her, her career trajectory, and have lots of chats with her. And so just, finding people that you are comfortable with, and that you can share, some of your insecurities with, or some of your, concerns with, and have them respond, in a positive and encouraging manner, has just been, fantastic for me. And I'm really grateful for all the time that these many women have taken to chat with me and inspire me. And, I think that's, I'm also always, looking for ways to kind of pay that forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing this. It's also really inspiring to hear about your stories as well. So maybe shifting gear a little bit, Dimitri, would you want to conclude with our last set of questions?
Sure. I'm also very curious about the advisor aspect of managing a diverse group of backgrounds, diverse group of people, with just like rounding it up. Maybe do you have an advice for people who want to bring in diverse groups, and what are the challenges that arise, like from cultures, backgrounds, and I don't know, genders, whatnot? I'm myself a new professor in Singapore, which is a highly diverse place. So I would be really curious to see if you have any advice.
Yeah, I think that it's a really great question. And I think it's one of those things that, it's sort of some lifelong learning that has to happen. When it's not something you're really well trained for as a PhD student, how to advise students. I had my relationship with my advisor. I saw how he mentored me and how he advised me, and how that worked, things about that worked well, and things that maybe, didn't work well, and sort of use that. And then, get to Toronto and, realize all my students are very different. They all have different ways they want to interact, and they all have different, backgrounds. And so it really is, learning how to, connect with each individual student, and figuring out which, what techniques different students need, students who need, maybe more oversight and more attention, students who need, longer, sort of more free reign, they can go and kind of, go off and be inspired and come back. And so trying to, figure that out. And so, when new students join my group, having conversations with them about, what they perceive as their working style, how they would like the interactions to go, and sort of always being open to evolving and not saying there's no one size fits all. I'm not going to mentor all my students in the exact same way. I want to make sure they all get, an equal quality of mentoring. Everybody, all of them, I want them all to succeed and get the same, value from the experience, but knowing that the approach might be different based on, their personalities or their backgrounds. And so it's definitely a challenge. Nobody trains you as a PhD student, in the management of people. My partner's a manager, and so sometimes I go to him for like people management advice, just because he has a little more training in that area than I do. But it's definitely been a challenge, and so something that I'm continuing to learn how to do better.
That's right. That's right. So we were also curious about how this advisor like mentee relationship was affected by COVID, and in general your experience, how universities handle the COVID problem, and what like lessons and challenges we learned about during this time. Like there have been like 2 or 3 years with a lot of pressure and problems. So I wonder if you can share your experience and maybe give some suggestions for future that may hold the similar situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, the COVID times were, extraordinarily challenging on many different fronts. I mean, specifically focusing on, the advising, as you asked about, it was very challenging, I felt, from my perspective, to, engage with my students, on Zoom. I think that the conversations we would have in person, in my office were, much more natural and much more kind of back and forth. I find, the Zoom to be, at least initially, maybe it's a little better now, but initially it felt a little more kind of stilted, or, it wasn't the conversation didn't always flow as well with the graduate students. And I was also trying to be really mindful, to not place any undue pressure on my graduate students, acknowledging that, during the COVID times, a lot of people dealt with, more mental wellness issues, dealing with isolation, dealing with being, separated from, family, with, limited ability to travel, having, border closures and travel restrictions. And so knowing that there was this huge sort of weight of the world, kind of sitting on graduate students, not wanting to push them. And so trying to figure out, how to interact with them, how to ensure that they were doing well, as sort of in a holistic perspective, not just well in graduate studies, was really challenging. But it was also challenging. I was home with my daughter was 4 at the time, and so I was home. I was trying to do virtual kindergarten and trying to figure out teaching and trying to be there for my graduate students, and so it was a lot. And I think that there was also this constant pressure to just kind of carry on as though this were not a lot. And I felt that, there were some, I think there was a program from the government of Canada that provided, PIs with, sort of 3 months of funding, extra funding for graduate students, because that was, I guess, the length of the impact of COVID was 3 months on research. I don't know. It was just sort of like, here's 3 months. And then after that, go back to normal. And it was like, it's not normal, and, we can't expect necessarily the same outputs. And, there was the University of Toronto maintained its similar sort of time to degree expectations. Students had to hit certain milestones, and it's like, okay, could we pause with the milestones? Like my students don't necessarily need to get their thesis proposal done on time, because this is a really chaotic time. And so I felt like there was just sort of this pressure to continue work as normal, which just felt wrong to me. And so I think that we can maybe learn that we can, if there is another event like this, hopefully not, that we can get through it, but maybe in a slightly kinder way, with a lot less, pressure on everyone. But we'll see. I'm not sure how much we learned over the last 3 years will be there the next time something like this happens, but I certainly hope so.
I also see some positive change as well, because at least for me, it became much more natural to collaborate across borders. Because before, I remember when I was doing my PhD, you would only talk like 99% with your colleagues in a lab or maybe at a conference. Now it feels much more natural to just like set up a Zoom call, to have a remote internship when people cannot come. So I feel some positive change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I think that we had more, maybe, more virtual, speakers, speakers come to, give virtual talks and courses and stuff where you might not get an industry person, to give up a day and a half to travel, to speak, to give a seminar or talk to your class. I think that it enabled more of those kind of opportunities too, kind of saying, okay, we can do these, virtual collaborations, virtual presentations. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that, the existing remote collaborations I had, I think became, better during COVID than before, because it sort of became, instead of being the one person on, like, I was the one person on Zoom, everybody else was in a conference room together. And so it's kind of stilted. Well, then everybody was just on Zoom because it made it easier. And so I agree. I think that there were definitely some benefits in that regard.
And also it seems the PC meetings are gone for good. So now it's all Zoom.
Yes, I have mixed feelings about that. I think that prior to COVID, I was sort of like, okay, we need to rethink the PC meeting, because I didn't think it was, the greatest idea from sort of a travel sustainability perspective. You have all these people flying in from all over the world for 36 to 48 hours, and maybe not the most effective use of time and resources. And so I think then COVID forced us into virtual, which I think is here to stay and has a lot of benefits in terms of travel and whatnot. But I do feel for assistant professors who have lost, this vital networking opportunity. I think that having the program committee meetings in person, where you were, in a room with 50 or 60, senior researchers, having a chance to chat with them. So I think we need to think as a community how we can ensure that, junior members of the community, assistant professors are networking well and being integrated in the community in the face of losing the physical PC meeting. So, I never thought I'd say I'd miss this, but I miss the orchard room in the basement of the O'Hare Hilton, because I spent many hours there with many great friends. And I think that those times are behind us. But we need to think of ways to kind of replicate some of the benefits of those in-person meetings.
Right. And actually, talking of conference organizations, it seems that our conferences are undergoing a lot of transformation right now, like multiple deadlines and one-shot revisions and whatnot. And it seems that ASPOS is actually at forefront of all this transformation. It seems like ASPOS takes the place of the most experimental platform. So I wonder, maybe from your own experience, do you see some need for change? Do you see some positive already change that happened already?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was super excited to be able to be one of the co-program chairs for the multi-deadline ASPOS, the first one in 2023. It was an exciting, transition. This was something that several of us had been advocating for in the architecture community for a number of years. And I think that, we just have too many papers that I think, sort of play this sort of reviewer roulette. They get a set of reviews at conference A, they fix all those issues, they go to conference B, there's a completely different set of reviewers with a completely different set, of concerns, and your paper just kind of ping pongs around. And so the revision model really allows, I think, authors to, have a better pathway to acceptance. And so the goal was to kind of accept more papers and to strengthen the papers that we were accepting. And so I think there's still more innovation, more refinement, needed. There were certainly things that were, challenging. The workload for the ASPOS 23 PC was much higher than, previous, PC workloads. And so I think we still need to think about that, but I think we tend to be too stingy with the number of papers we accept. There's a lot of good work out there, and, having 14, 15, 16% acceptance rates, I think is just artificially low. And so something, higher than that is to the benefit of our community. And so I'm excited that ASPOS is willing to innovate and, will do this experiment for a few years, learn a bunch of things, figure out how to make it better, figure out what pieces we want to apply to other conferences in our communities. And I think it's the start of, some much needed change.
Do you think we will see positive change soon? Like, when do you think we will be able to actually, quantitatively argue that we achieved an improvement in conference organization?
So that's a really tough question. I think we will, see, and I think though it all depends on your perspective. I see, pushing towards, say, a 30% acceptance rate for Ask Plus as a positive change. I know some people feel that, the lower the acceptance rate, the more prestigious, the more, the better it looks on their CV. And so some people are pushing back against a higher acceptance rate. So, not everybody sees these things the same way. Some conferences, prefer, say, to be, single track. They want, everybody to be able to attend, all the talks. Ask Plus went to 3 parallel tracks. Had we accepted any more papers, it could have been 4 parallel tracks. And so I think that there's some tension. Some people say, well, but I like the way the conferences are as they are now. And so how do you evolve the conference itself as we accept more papers? Talks have gotten much shorter than they were when I was a PhD student. I think that's a good thing. Some people, I think, prefer, the longer talks. And so, I think we're going to see, we're going to see positive change, but it's going to involve, more community discussion, because not everybody wants things to evolve in the same way. So I think that's the challenge. And, Ask Plus also represents 3, related but different communities. I think that from the system side of things, when they had, SOSP and OSDI didn't occur every year. And so then, they moved to occurring, every year. And then all of a sudden Ask Plus is like, we're going to do 3 deadlines. And so I think that the systems people are like, wow, that's a whole lot of deadlines for the systems community. Whereas, architecture has been coming to this position, slowly over many years. And so it's interesting to have all those different voices and figure out how we can reconcile and have change that is generally positive for the broader community.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of interesting events and transformations that our community will go through. I think we had a great time with an interview with you, Natalie. Thank you for joining. We've heard a lot of interesting insights about how diversity initiatives evolve and how COVID affects the university life. And it was really interesting to hear stories from your own experience on different sides of things. So yeah, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. It was great. I really enjoyed it. So
great. Thank you. So with that, we will conclude our interview, and thanks everyone for attending. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.